Okay, so how I want to start is just really to jump into this, Lewanne. How was the Victor Jara Collective formed? And what were the circumstances that led you guys to come to Guyana? And then maybe, Richard, you could just go straight into what was Guyana like at the time when they arrived?
Well, as you kindly pointed out in your introduction, we all met at Cornell University in the late 1975, 1976 in the context of a Marxist study group that was organized by Rupert Roopnarine with a lot of his students. He was teaching comparative literature at Cornell at the time. Inspired by various things that had gone on, inspired and chagrined by things like Chile, the 1973 coup in Chile and subsequent events there, and other international things that were happening. I think Rupert made the decision. Well, I think Walter actually came to Cornell in that time frame, in the 75, 76, maybe Pat remembers correctly, and talked to Rupert about why the heck hadn't he ever been back to Guyana since he left on a scholarship in the early 60s to study here, and then came to the United States. So we met, we got together. Ray Krill, who was one of the filmmakers and shot a lot of the film, was teaching filmmaking at Cornell at the time, and we all got together and did a little project together in the summer of '76. And on the basis of all of that, Rupert decided to go back to Guyana. He packed up his considerable library, and those of us who were there doing the filmmaking workshop were invited to come with, and his idea was to integrate himself back into the culture, was that he would organize to make a film.
So just for those who might not know, Rupert Roopnarine, Guyanese, born and raised, won a scholarship and went to Oxford, I believe, on scholarship, Cambridge. And then moved to the US to teach at Cornell.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, right. Yeah.
So that was that's how we got there, and then Rupert used his connections in the society, the people that he knew, in order to get us initial cooperation from the Ministry of Culture in order to make this film. And we did have not money support, but material support they provided us in order to get into some of the locations. We shot in prisons and other places we wouldn't have been able to get into as just civic society filmmakers.
So Richard, when Lewanne says that Walter Rodney said to Rupert, that you need to come back, what was the situation he was pointing to that he felt?
If you forgive me, the best way to answer that is to actually go into a slightly deeper context and to really begin where that film began, which is with Frantz Fanon, the Martinican psychologist, who writes in 1952-53 this book, Black Skin, White Masks, about how the experience of race in the context of colonial domination was one of being broken in two, literally, forms of alienation, the self which is estranged, made strange to itself. He went on later on in a book called Wretched of the Earth to write a series of essays about how anti-colonial struggle was connected to this business of disalienation. So the first chapter begins with the role of struggle and of violence in turning this distorted sense of self into something which one can acquire one's wholeness again. One can kind of turn that mental illness, which is the colonial order, into something which is whole and human. But later on in that same book, Fanon writes about what he calls the pitfalls of national consciousness, and he diagnoses how in the early post-colonial states emerging in Africa, forms of new distortions are emerging, and which are based on this fracture in the society, experienced as class, experienced as race, experienced as forms of colonial and neo-colonial domination that are reproducing themselves in the distorted experience of these societies. Now, for that generation of men and women born in the 1940s, Walter Rodney, born 1942, Anne Dye, born 1942, Rupert Roopnarine, born 1943, Morris Bishop, born 1944. This is a generation which is growing up after the wave of politicization of the 1930s in the Caribbean, and who are growing up in the midst of the moment of decolonization in the world, and they are becoming 20, that critical decade in the 1960s, and confronting that in their own societies throughout the Caribbean, forms of this neo-colonial disease were constituting themselves. They looked at someplace like Trinidad. They looked at with Eric Williams, who was perpetuating a particular way or mode of leadership, that distorted leadership which Rodney talks about in passing in The Sky's Wild Noise, in which, in fact, which was part of this colonial way of thinking about education and culture of the intellectual, where the intellectual would be separated and fractured and in a position of exploitation or domination, often in the form of leadership of the masses. So if you look at that generation of the 1940s, what they really were concerned with breaking was that experience of alienation, experienced both in terms of the economy, in terms of politics, but also in terms of culture and of the life of the spirit. Mm-hmm. So we have to see as parallels what Walter Rodney was doing when he comes back from university in England and he comes to Jamaica, in which he conducts in the late 1960s what he called groundings. When he did this thing which absolutely shocked the university administrators. He went down from the hill, from Mona, down to the Dungle, and he met with Rastafarians and with working people and sat on the ground and tried to communicate to them what he had learned as a historian and also to learn from them, to break down this form of confrontation between the educated and the uneducated, to liberate new forms of energy within the working class, but also within the educated. And this is exactly what the Victor Jara Collective was trying to do with the film, because the film had to do, and we have to see this as being very similar to what Ngugi wa Thiong'o was doing with theatre in Kenya at this time, with what Sistren was doing with theatre in Jamaica, what Derek Walcott and Errol Jones were doing with theatre in Trinidad, which is the question, how do you communicate with the intelligence of working people, people who have a relationship to the word, which is a living oral relationship, in which the form of the word, which is contained within the book, is a form of isolation and fracture. So they were concerned in that film to take the poetry of Martin Carter out of the prison of the book and to bring it into this form, the film, which would return to the working people that genius which they themselves had produced. So it was a work of disalienation, which they saw as both a political work, and an intellectual work, and an artistic and a filmic work. So if you look at those films, what they are turning to are all the resources they can think of to try to break down that alienation between working people and the world which they had produced. They turn to a very important influence in these films is the Russian filmmaker Vertov. And Vertov, who is a filmmaker right after the Russian Revolution, experiments with using the camera and using non-literal and non-literary forms of filmmaking. He has a very famous called for A Man with a Movie Camera. To bring the lives of production, of working people, of how people live, into a filmic form which could then be consumed and received by working people. So they could see themselves, not mediated through texts or books which were contained in discursive forms which were part of that colonial order, part of that space of privilege from which they had been excluded, but in media which would be immediate. So the film is concerned with making a bridge between working people's experience and working people's history in Guyana. And in particular, it's concerned with opening up a conversation, with disinterring, releasing from the tomb, releasing from the prison, a set of historical experiences of the anti-colonial struggle, in particular of the 1950s, and making them alive, accessible, powerful in the particular context of the 1970s. So what were these two moments? The 1950s is a moment in which we have this anti-colonial struggle, which had begun in the 1930s and 40s, reaching a culmination in the first elected government by democratic suffrage of the PPP, which is then crushed by the colonial government after having been in government for a matter of months. with the suspension of the constitution by a variety of repressive laws. The party that was elected at that time, the PPP, was split in two. The Afro-Guyanese part of the party, at least part of it, not all, led by Burnham, Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham, the gentleman in the bow tie who we saw in the film, broke away to form a separate political party which constituted itself principally around the population of Guyana resident in the cities who were racialized as Afro-Guyanese, and it sought to mobilize around itself the historic forms of anxiety and cleavage and rivalry and which had existed, which had been promoted during the colonial period between Afro and Indo-Guyanese. And the independence which Guyana eventually has in 1966 is one which is led by this particular party, the PNC, with the patronage of Britain and the United States, who, in a period of covert action in the early 60s, destroyed the PPP government, then in power, and in comes Burnham. Anyway, fast forward to the 70s, and the regime... Sorry, am I...
Well, this is the point I want to get to. The point at which the collective is working because they run into trouble with the government, don't they?
Well, in the 1970s, what you have is Burnham's government, after having a series of rigged elections in 68 and then in 73, is extremely concerned about the return to Guyana of this generation born in the 1940s, who are in the case of Walter Rodney is offered the professorship of history at the University of Guyana. The government of Guyana blocks this and prevents him getting a job. So what Rodney talked about, this exclusion from work, that was a very personal experience, not just one shared by others in the population. The Rup came back and faced a kind of a certain degree of secret police service scrutiny. The moment they attempted to try to mobilize and create any kind of political presence, they then faced gangs of thugs who then disrupted them. So this film is made in the context of the awakening of a new period of struggle against this Burnham regime in Guyana, one which is animated by this generation born in the 40s, who are a product of what you could think of as the global 1960s and who are returning to Guyana.
Lewanne, I was wondering, was there ever a sense while you were making the film that you were going to run into trouble, or was it when you took the rushes and the government looked at the rushes that then you realized we have a problem here?
I think it was pretty much the latter case. We were given pretty good cooperation in terms of gaining access to places that we wanted to go. We had the facilities at a beautiful new government film center to use, so they were able to give us film, process our film, afford us a place to record sound and a place to edit the film that we were making. And then they also gave us access and provided us with some transportation to various places like the Camp Street prison, the prison up in Bardica, where some of the shots were, scenes were filmed. So we took advantage of having some of this equipment and some of this to do some other shooting at the time, which was including the interview that we did with Walter, an interview with Clive Thomas, and some other opposition people that we knew were not going to be in the 1953 story. But it was only when we were obliged to show a cut of the film to the Minister of Information, who at the time was a woman by the name of Shirley Field Ridley. And we did that, and then in a discussion afterwards, the minister kindly invited us to remove Cheddi Jagan from the film because even though he had been the chief political person, I don't know if he was prime minister, if it was that, anyway, as you can tell from what he said in the film, they invited us to remove him because her exact words were that a film that was being sponsored by the Guyana government at that particular time could not be seen to be giving sustenance to the opposition. So they invited us to remove him from the film, or they suggested that they would happily finish the film for us, which obviously neither thing was in the realm of possibility in anything that we anticipated. So at that point in time, we figured out a way, or we started to figure out a way to remove the actual physical elements that we needed to finish the film the way we wanted to. And Rupert was able to use some friends in order to take those physical elements out of the country. And that's where Richard comes in, because I waited for Rupert and the film to come in Barbados, staying with his family, and got to know Richard.
The story of how the film got out is an amusing one, because Rupert had gone to Cambridge with Derek Murray, who was then the wicket-keeper for the West Indies cricket team. And cricketers travel with lots of kit. So that he had a word with Derek, and because that's the Trinidad, some cricketers were playing in Guyana at the time, and the film went out in the cricket kit of Derek Murray.
It's the first time I'm hearing that. That's amazing. So at what point do you come into the story, Keith? When did you first see the film, and how were you invited to work on it?
Well, it's very interesting to listen to this now, because one of the things as a youngster, because I'm one of the persons who were born late 40s. See? So that was interesting. And also because in Guyana we were also like UC Guyana mentioned it, that we were using poetry and music together. So I was one of the people who were experimenting with music and poetry. And also I was using non-traditional instruments, like my bamboo flute and things like that. So that's the kind of time when I came in. And also I knew Rupert, I never met Walter, but I knew Rupert and knew all the radicals, because we were experimenting. And this is one of the things I did. So we had things like because I went to India to study Indian music. So a lot of the stuff that I wrote subsequently was using African Indian music together. Like this example. And then I went on to transfer that with other musicians, because they never had a chance to play with people who didn't come from England and who knew about the culture. So I was able to play things like and then I incorporated with the Yoruba singers. Yoruba singers were the first musicians I worked with, and we try and incorporate a lot of it in the film. So when I saw the film, these were the kind of inspiration. And we didn't play very complicated things, because that's not what creative music was about. So it sounds like if you're going to play a flute, so we have a flute rhythm, and then we use delays and reverbs to make it more interested in the process of the film. Mm. And that's how I got involved.
So did this happen in Guyana before they left?
Yes, in Guyana.
Saw the film and
I saw it, yes.
And you did the work
and
there.
in fact, we mentioned this today. I was saying this, that the cultural center was built after. And where you recorded was used for the recording of our stuff. Because listen to the quality. Did you notice the quality of the sound is so phenomenal? In 40 years later, you can still hear a quality of music that is really beautiful. I got to spend a lot of money when I'm making my albums. I got to go into an expensive studio. But in Guyana, we had the remarkable, talented people who were able to create all this music, and create all this recordings of a standard that is higher, that is better than a lot of the stuff we do internationally. So that's how I got involved.
So this was you said that this was a time of great creative experimenting in Guyana, and Richard, as you said, in the Caribbean as a whole, in theatre, music as well. But film is a special case, because in the English-speaking Caribbean, nothing like this happened elsewhere. These films like these really only the Victor Jara Collective were working on this. Yeah. So when you saw this film, and Lewanne, when you were showing the film, like when the government saw it and so on, what was the reaction in terms of the form of the film? Like when you saw it, this was not a conventional documentary. What were the reactions?
Well, the reactions from the musicians, especially the Yoruba singers, because there were a lot of musicians who were radical at that time. So they didn't want to worry about the government thinks and what the government would say about writing this. They were writing songs, like I'm bringing in all the African songs, all the Indian songs. So they never worried.
Keith, were they linked to Askria?
Askria.
They were linked to Askria.
Askria. Yes.
Okay, so that's a bit of the story there, because you saw Usi Kwayana, who was describing what Martin Carter's poetry was like.
Yeah.
Well, Usi Kwayana, who was the PP minister and had maintained his own created his own independent organization in the midst of the Black Power movement. What did Askria mean? It was something like the African Society for
Culture and because he was very much encouraging of our culture.
He believed that culture and politics were one thing, and that you had to work from where people were, which in his community was this community called Buxton, which was a free village, which is to say a village which had been bought by former slaves at the end of emancipation and turned into what was effectively a collective, a cooperative way of living. And he created this organization which was intended to try to find a way through culture to break up the forms of political stagnation and fracture which were part of that society.
And was very refreshing this year. Pat is here. I was in Atlanta and I met up with UC, and he's such a beautiful man.
Pure spirit.
Absolute spirit. And he was able to even talk to me about some of it from the old period. And he spoke about Walter and the work he was doing. So a lot of us, even though I was in a younger generation, I was still being inspired by the older musicians and artists and writers and politicians. So the Burnhams of this world didn't affect me at all. We kept away from all of that because we were still creating something vibrant.
And Lewanne, what would you say was the reaction of Guyanese people who saw this film at that time?
Well, at that time, I was not aware of very many Guyanese people who saw the film until, if you mean in the 70s, shortly thereafter in the 80s, I think we got a very positive reaction because people had not been able to see their history presented on the screen at all. I don't know if the formal experimental sort of hybrid quality of the film was ever criticized, although I think somebody at BAM, the recent screening at BAM, spoke a little bit to that and came up to me afterwards and said he felt it wasn't the experience of every Guyanese, and I wasn't, I didn't really have a chance to get into that. But I think in the earliest days, we used this film in a very political context, so it was kind of like AUC was saying, we were bringing this to the people, and there was just a lot of appreciation for seeing so much of the culture put forward, the scenes, the individuals, the newspaper headlines, and everything kind of just gave people a visual coming together of a story that really just wasn't being presented on screens anywhere at that time.
I want to ask about the Latin American influence, because of course you call yourselves the Victor Jara Collective, after Victor Jara, whose name has been in the headlines again recently with what's been happening in Chile. The protesters have been singing his songs. So you call yourself the Victor Jara Collective. You were very much influenced by new Latin American cinema Novo, Third Cinema, the Cuban filmmakers Santiago Alvarez and so on. I wonder if Guyana, being part of South America, but politically and historically part of the Caribbean, was there a Latin American influence in the culture in Guyana at all, or was it all focused on being, former British colony, Caribbean?
Well, I think one of the things for me is that Cuba was very important to us, and we were very much influenced by Castro and what he was doing, and also because Guyana this time Burnham is becoming more and more repressive, and we couldn't get medical help. So we had a lot of Cuban doctors coming to Guyana and helping us out and looking up. Like my dad had a problem of his hip, and the Cuban doctors helped his hip, repaired his hip, and they had all this. But we never had this as a formal anything to do because Burnham was repressing everybody.
Richard?
The connections between, as your question in fact was suggesting, the connections between the English-speaking Caribbean and Latin America at a cultural level were historically very weak, and that in fact, as the film was showing in terms of cultural alienation, somebody in Guyana would know far more about the coronation in London or about what was a popular song in the United States than they would know about what was happening anywhere in Latin America. And I think part of what that generation, the 1940s, wanted to do was to, in fact, to break that alienation of the Caribbean from Latin America and to open up that conversation. And the impact of Cuban film in particular is extremely important, because the Cubans, of course, had taken up some of these Soviet filmic techniques and put them to work in a Caribbean context. And this was something I think was very inspiring to someone like Rupert in terms of imagining what was possible. But I think we want to also take stock of the non-Guyanese contributors to this, of course, and we have Lewanne here. We also have Ray Krill, we also have Susuma Tokono. And I think this film is very much also a product of what you could think of as global 1968. And the ways in which the new left in the global north had come to recognize a couple of things. One is that the old left's relationship to certain kinds of canonical texts offered a dead end in terms of real revolutionary mobilization, but secondly also that the dynamic in terms of international liberation appeared to be on the side of the third world. And it appeared to be on the side of these struggles, which is in the case of Vietnam, which you must remember the Vietnamese had won by 1975. Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau had all, in the wake of the Portuguese Revolution, won by the mid-1970s. That for people who were on the left in the global north, the engagement on the ground with these struggles represented one of the most important ways in which they could do justice to their own sense of their own politics. And what made this film partly possible was the fact that you had these people who brought all this training and film skills. It's difficult to make a film of this kind, or to even conceive of its possibility. And that there was this transfer of technology and of technique and of passion and of spirit, which was coming into communication with what people like Eusi Quayana and Asker were trying to do, to try to create a kind of popular art which would speak to both the contemporary crisis of Guyana and also its deeper history. You have to go back and watch that film 3 or 4 times to begin to see various kinds of things that they're doing. So, there was one particular moment where we were shown the plume of smoke coming out of Diamond Sugar Factory, and then jump cut. We're looking at an 18th century plantation image, and we're taken back, and a conversation is being set up between the history of Guyana in the late 18th century, in the midst of slavery, the history of Guyana in the 1940s and 50s, and what is happening in the 70s. And what they're seeking to do is to kind of open up an idea of both the continuity of oppression, but also the continuity of resistance over a long period of history, so that in fact this history becomes not something which is distant, but is a resource through which people could make their lives in the here and now.
I want to kind of jump on from that point, and in terms of when The Terror and the Time was then being screened. In Lewanne, you spoke to at the beginning, the films are being screened all over in churches and community centres in Brooklyn and so on. There were also screenings here in the UK and in the Netherlands. I don't know if you were present for any of them, but I want to read an interesting quote which is on the handout from Bert Hogenkamp, where he says, "I was present at a couple of the screenings of The Terror and the Time in the Netherlands and one in London. What struck me forcefully was that these West European intellectuals, who normally do their utmost to understand the work of bourgeois avant-garde filmmakers such as Jean-Luc Godard, Marguerite Duras, Chantal Akerman, Jean-Marie Straub, Daniel Houillet, made no effort to understand this film. It did not seem to create a sense of liberation for them. On the other hand, for the people of the Caribbean in London and for the Surinamese in the Netherlands, the film sparked off enormous debates." What do you have to say to that?
I didn't encounter that because I was mainly doing the the community screenings and the university screenings and the people who I think were more inclined to be receptive. So I didn't suffer the slings and arrows of the. So no, I mean, I remember when Bert wrote that, but I wasn't there to experience that.
I mean, what I would want to say about the Guyana screenings is this film was made with an intention that this film would be part of political work in Guyana, and it would be shown and it would become part of ongoing struggles. But in the context of Guyana, the PNC regime becomes more repressive in the 1970s. Out of the ASCRIA and several other political groups in Guyana, a new political force called the Working People's Alliance, which Walter Rodney mentioned, was constituted by 1976-77. And the Working People's Alliance was in a position of competition, not just with the party that was in power, the PNC, but also with the principal opposition party, the PPP. So when this film comes out, attempts to screen this film are disrupted by agents of the state, the plainclothes agents of the state, so this film cannot actually be returned. And the PPP also has an ambivalent relationship to this film. On the one hand, the PPP liked the way in which this film made visible the central role of Cheddi Jagan in that struggle. On the other hand, because the film was identified with the Working People's Alliance, the PPP also had a somewhat cautious relationship to what this film would represent. So in many ways, this film never was able to fulfill that side of its mission and to return home. What it played a part in was in the WPA support groups in New York and in London and elsewhere, and in Canada, as part of the ways in which people kept contact with that particular struggle.
All right. Well, we're going to be, I'm sure very soon, having to wrap up, but I do want to throw it open just for as long as we have to be able to get some audience questions, brief ones, please, if anyone has one. So there's a gentleman here with his hand up.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
May I just quickly ask, what is the current situation in Guyana, if anyone can tell me, compared to 10, 20 or...
Okay, that's a brief question, but the answer to that is probably not going to be a brief one. But
there was an election in 2013 which brought to power a government which was putatively a coalition government, which is going to come to the polls sometime later this year. Whether we will have a free and fair election is a matter which is doubtful for many people for a variety of reasons, but we shall see. But that would be a long story.
We should probably mention that Rupert Rupnayan was Minister of Education in that coalition government until he had to resign due to ill health a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Any?
What was that? Oh, I will, yeah.
There's a hand up.
Another question.
The lady, yes.
I just wanted to say that the election was 2015, not
2015,
2013.
yeah.
But the film was evocative for me in other ways, because at that time I worked with the support group here.
Yeah.
And it was really exciting because it was after, we got hold of it after Rodney's assassination. And people were able to see him articulating a lot of the ideas that caused his death in a way. And also the Burnham regime at the time had been considered progressive, and in the Cuba context they allowed the Cuban planes that were supporting the liberation struggles to stop over to refuel in Guyana. And the people who are part of the current government always repeat that and try to present themselves as progressive. So one was able to use the film to help that discussion about, they might appear and have all the words of being progressive, but really they're part of the problem. And so it was really helpful at that time to have a resource like that showed Rodney in his own words and enabled that discussion about why you might think, because at that time there were still lots of people in London from the anti-apartheid movement, from African liberation struggles, and also from Caribbean struggles. And we were constantly at that time having debates with people who were saying, you can't do this, you can't say this because it's our government, it's a black government, you can't do this. And that film really helped and supported that discussion.
Yeah.
Do we have anyone else? Any question? Or no comment? Yes, Dunya.
My question was to do with the film and its structure in kind of 3 parts. And my perception of it is probably warped now because we had a couple of breaks. But, you know, obviously there was this lengthy section that was part 1, colonialism. And then you had part 2, neo-colonialism, and part 3.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
There
so
should be a better title in there, and I was kind of surprised that there wasn't. The part 1 is the only part that really was made. The
Right.
original idea, and this kind of came from a 70s filmmaking at the time, and partially from a film that was very influential to Rupert, which is Hour of the Furnaces, which is an Argentinian film about the Peronist movement, and it was in 3 parts. So the first part was made. The little part afterwards is kind of a tease or a trailer for what would have been the second and third parts. And the second part was going to be about the kind of how independence was engineered and came about in the 1960s. So there's footage in there from archival footage of the troubles in Wismar and various things that happened in that period in the lead up to the to when independence was granted in 66. And then there was going to be a kind of a liberation, I think it was called
Notes Towards Liberation.
Notes Towards Liberation. So I can't really tell you exactly what that was going to be. I mean, it was all going to evolve, and we shot as much footage as we could when we were working there, which was intended to be for those 2 sections, but it was also kind of interesting because, as you could tell probably, we incorporated some of that footage because the conditions that people were talking about in the 50s were essentially the same as the conditions that we were able to film in the 70s. And so that was kind of why, and that might have been an unspoken reason why the government, when they saw it, didn't want the film to continue. Because if you say the people are living in, slavery type things, and you show it in your film about the 50s, but you filmed it in the 70s, well,
Yeah.
So where is all that footage now? All that additional footage?
That's a good question. Well, because cricketers might travel with a lot of kit, but they don't travel with container vans. We could only take from Guyana what we kind of thought we were going to. So we spent nights in the editing room, sort of cutting things out and putting them away so that we could have a minimal amount of stuff to remove. So what we did bring out is with me in my house in Brooklyn. What we didn't bring out may no longer exist. I know people who've subsequently tried to, find things from the 70s in, films in Guyana, and people at, in places just go, So some future historians may unearth boxes or cans of things somewhere in Guyana, but that stuff was left, a large amount of that stuff was left in Guyana, and the rest of the stuff I have.
Can I just follow up that
Yes.
really quickly? So you had to smuggle out the material.
Mhm.
What happened with the collective? What happened with the project? I mean, you put together what we saw today.
Right.
Was there an idea that you would continue working to make parts 2 and 3? What happened with the group?
Well, yeah, we worked in New York with the very kind cooperation of a film company called Third World Newsreel, which allowed us to use their editing room late at night. And we did that for 4 or 5 months, and then were able to finish the film. The Susumu and Ray stayed in New York. Susumu was from California, and Ray, he taught upstate New York. So I think the idea was that we none of us had jobs in that time frame, and we were all just trying to do things and on a shoestring, and nobody had any place to live. So eventually Rupert went back to Guyana. So then we went back to California. Ray moved to Holland, but then he actually ended up going back to Guyana for several years and worked with Rupert and with other people in another media project and made a handful of more films. But the initiative to, at that point, Rupert was getting more involved in politics, and I think just I don't know, it just never happened, the next two parts. After Walter was killed, I realized I was sitting on the interview footage and, the film, the extra archives that we did manage to secure, and I put together that film, and that was, I guess, the second one, but not the second one as we had originally intended it.
Anyone else?
There's a request.
We have a request.
Okay.
So maybe you want to contextualize.
Yeah, because this is one of my 200 flutes, and I've used it a lot in my current compositions and work that I'm doing for BBC Radio 4 and all the other things. You call it things? Yeah.
But this is from the film, though.
But this is from the film, and what I didn't play was you're going to hear, because I use some of the effects of the rainforest and things like that. So we have. And then from the film. You can help me. 1, 2, 3, 4, and a 1, 2, 3, 4, and a 1, 2, 3. Keep that going. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any more, maybe not requests, but questions? Oh, yes.
Actually, do have a request. When Dr. Rodman was speaking last week, one of the issues that came up was the systematic erasure of the ideas of Walter Rodney, and what you also managed to capture, which I wasn't aware of until I showed this to my mother, because she'd left Guyana in the interim between the British terror and 1964, and she didn't know about any of this. And that history has been lost, but also the way the WPA organized, which was so superior to anything that was going on, I think, at that time, and you've gotten that. These films are on YouTube, but is there any type of project to get them marketed and with director cuts and extra?
I'm personally trying to arrange to get a better digital copy made, so that we lost the printing element, shall we say. So the best quality original is a good, print like what you saw today, only one that hasn't been projected as frequently. And I would like to raise the money at some point to get a version that would be digitized to contemporary standards, because the YouTube and Internet Archive ones are not, and to have somebody, work on it to improve both the sound quality and the image stuff. So I guess that's as much of an initiative as there is at the moment, but I appreciate you.
Well, we do hope that can happen, and as I said during one of the breaks, it's a story common to many Caribbean films, and something that needs to be worked on. And as I said, I know of people, and I'm helping a number of people, however I can to also do that. We need to wrap up. I just want to thank the audience again for your patience through everything. But I have proper official acknowledgements. So first of all, to the Birkbeck Institute for the Moving Image, especially Matthew Barrington, in the back there, Matthew, who wouldn't, offer this straight off the bat, but he's of Guyanese descent, so you could talk to him about that if you like. Katie Grant and Michael Temple, who was here earlier, but who had to leave. It was actually Michael's idea when I was in conversation with him once that we bring the films here. This was almost 2 years ago now, so thank you to Michael. Thank you to Guyana Speaks, to Rod Westmus and Juanita Cox Westmus for their support, to Third Horizon Film Festival, to CLAVS, the Center for Iberian and Latin American Visual Studies here at Birkbeck. Thanks to our projectionist Ursa as well for her instant work. And thank you to Keith Waithe and his flutes, to Richard Drayton. And most of all, please join me in thanking Lewanne Jones of the Victor Jara Collective.